If we claim to be Christians, it matters not only that we gather for worship and read our Bible and pray, it also matters how we act and what we say out in the world. Every part of our life, of our conduct, of our character matters. The Apostle Peter tells Christians in 1 Peter 2, he says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. And by Gentiles there he means the non-Christians. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So don't just claim to be Christian, right? But act like it. And know that there will be people who will accuse you of doing the wrong thing, of acting the wrong way. You need to make sure, though, that you act in the right way, that you conduct yourself in a way that is honorable and that honors the Lord, so that when people do accuse you of wrongdoing, if someone looks into that, they'll discover that you've actually been doing good. You've actually been doing the right thing, and they'll give glory to God for that. The Apostle Paul says something similar. He says in Romans 12, he says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Right? Try to get along. Right? Sometimes you can't make relationships work, but don't let it be your fault if you can help it. Right? You try to be the peaceable one. You try to be the reasonable one. You try to be the faithful one. But you can't control how other people respond, right? But you do the best you can to live at peace with all. Now, that's what Paul says we should do. Did Paul do that? Did Paul live up to his own expectations of other Christians? Because Paul gets accused in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 24, he gets accused of this. Somebody says, we have found this man, talking about Paul, we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. Now, is that a fair accusation against Paul? We do know a lot of the places that Paul went, trouble followed. How many times did Paul get arrested? How many times was Paul thrown in jail? Did riots break out around Paul? Yes. Okay, so is this accusation against Paul fair? Are the rumors about him true? Is he a troublemaker and a disturber of the peace? Or does Paul act honorably and aim to live peaceably, and these people are firing false accusations against him? And if we look closely, we'll actually see that Paul is doing good and give glory to God. Which one is it? Now, when Luke wrote the book of Acts, he apparently had that question on his mind. He knew about these rumors about Paul, and he knew what the consequences would be if people believed that Paul, who was spreading the gospel of Jesus, was actually a troublemaker, someone who stirred up riots, someone who caused problems and disturbed the peace. If that was true, that would persuade a lot of people not to listen to Paul, not to believe his gospel. In fact, the person that Luke wrote the book of Acts primarily for, a man named Theophilus, he mentions in the opening verses, was probably a pretty high-standing Roman ruler. He's called Most Excellent Theophilus, which is a term that's used for high-ranking people in the Roman world. And so perhaps Theophilus himself was wondering, this message that I've heard about Jesus, I'm inclined to believe it. But if the Paul who's preaching it is a disturber of the peace, I'm not sure if I can continue to believe it. So Luke lays out for us in Acts chapter 19 a lengthy but important account of what really happened when a riot broke out in Ephesus while Paul was there. Luke is setting the record straight and helping us understand what's really going on versus what the rumors are. And in doing so, he reminds us of the importance of our reputation and our character in the world. Because here's the truth. The reputation of the church as a whole and the reputation of individual Christians matter. They matter. Your reputation as a Christian matters. Our reputation as a church matters. The reputation of the church as a whole matters. How we conduct ourselves matters. If Christians stir up division, stoke anger, promote hatred, instigate violence, and we get called out for that, that's not persecution. That's just. Right? We deserve that. We should not be doing that. If, on the other hand, people falsely accuse us of stirring up division, stirring up hatred, promoting violence, if they look carefully at our words and our deeds, they should see the opposite. They should see kindness. They should see unity. They should see love. They should see humility. So, as we look at what Luke says happened in Ephesus when this riot broke out while Paul was there, what I want you to have in your mind as we go through this passage is, what do we want people to know about us, to say about us, to see in us in the way we conduct ourselves in the world? So let's look together at Acts chapter 19, beginning in verse 21. I'm going to read all the way down to verse 41. It's a little bit longer than what we normally do, but this all hangs together. So let's look at it together. Here's what Luke tells us. It says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I have been there, I must also see Rome.' And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. Now about that time there arose no little disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen in similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. And you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. And there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom all Asia and the world worship.' When they heard this, they were enraged and were crying out, 'Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!' So the city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. But when Paul wished to go in among the crowd, the disciples would not let him. And even some of the Asiarchs, who were friends of his, sent to him and were urging him not to venture into the theater. Now some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Some of the crowd prompted Alexander, whom the Jews had put forward. And Alexander, motioning with his hand, wanted to make a defense to the crowd. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, For about 2 hours, they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple keeper of the great Artemis and of the sacred stone that fell from the sky? Seeing then that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. If therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. For we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify this commotion." And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly. All right, so Paul has been in Ephesus for some time. He's been preaching and ministering there. He has plans to go back to Jerusalem, and then after returning to Jerusalem to go to Rome. But for now, he remains in Ephesus, which is in the part of the world that at that time was called Asia, and that's today, more or less, that's Turkey, right? So that's where Paul is, that's where Ephesus is even today. And while he's been preaching in Ephesus, people have heard the word of the Lord. People have heard the gospel. People have heard Paul preaching about who God is and who Christ is and the way to be saved. And this has caused a problem for some people there in Ephesus. So Luke tells us in verse 23 that there arose no little disturbance. In other words, a big disturbance concerning the way, which is one of the ways that Christianity was described or named at the time, right? Jesus said himself that he is the way, the truth, and the life. Those who are following Jesus, they're following the way. And so there was a disturbance related to the Christian faith, related to what Paul was preaching. But who caused the disturbance? What often happens, or seems to happen, right, not just in the Bible, but in the world, is the person who's not doing anything wrong, but upsets somebody who then does do something wrong in response, tries to blame it on the guy that made them mad, but didn't actually cause the problem, right? And that's the kind of thing that happens all the time, right? We see it all the time. And it's more or less happening here, right? So Paul is preaching the gospel, and this man Demetrius, he's the one, though, that causes the problem. All Paul is doing is teaching. Remember, he had rented out a public room in the hall of Tyrannus, and he was preaching there, teaching people about Jesus, people coming from all over to hear what he has to say, most likely. And that's all he's doing. He's free to teach. He's free to reason. Remember, we see over and over in the book of Acts, what's Paul doing? He's reasoning with people. He's seeking to persuade people. But Paul does not try to stir up crowds to be violent or to be reckless or anything like that. But this Demetrius guy, he starts to stir up trouble. Now, Demetrius, we're told, is a silversmith. So he crafts things out of silver. And in particular, he crafts these shrines to the goddess Artemis, or your translation might even say Diana. The Greeks and the Romans have essentially the same gods, but they call them by different names, right? So if you see Diana instead of Artemis, it's the same goddess, just the Roman name versus the Greek name. So he makes these shrines that he sells to people who come to Ephesus or who live in Ephesus, who want to worship and honor this goddess Artemis. And Luke tells us at the end of verse 24 that Demetrius' business of making these shrines brought no little business to the craftsmen. So it's not just that Demetrius has a successful business, but his business also makes other people's businesses successful, right? Because there's multiple people involved in getting the silver and refining the silver and crafting the silver and whatever else they're doing. So Demetrius is a pretty important businessman, and there's a lot of other people who have important business tied up in his business. And so he brings these people together in verse 25, And he says, men, you know that from this business we have our wealth. Right? This is how we got rich. This is how we make our money. But that business is being threatened. Their wealth and therefore their power is being threatened. So he says in verse 26, you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people, saying that gods made with hands are not gods. So Paul's message has caused problems for Demetrius, because Demetrius makes a shrine to a goddess made with hands. And Paul has been saying, just like we saw earlier in Acts 17 when he was preaching in Athens, he's communicating the same message in Ephesus. Gods made with hands are not gods. Now to us, that's not shocking or surprising. To any Jew of Paul's day, that would not have been shocking or surprising. But to the Greeks, to the Romans, that was mostly unheard of. Remember when Paul was in Athens, he saw a number of idols all throughout the city. So many they even had one that said, we don't even know which God this is for, right? This is for the unknown God. But Paul's telling them, the real God doesn't need you to serve him. The real God made you. You don't make him. Right? The real God doesn't live in a temple. He's not confined by anything you could create. And people are starting to understand that. And they're starting to believe that. They're starting to be persuaded by Paul. And what's that doing? That's drying up Demetrius' business. Because not as many people are buying these shrines that Demetrius makes, because they're recognizing that these handcrafted idols, these handcrafted gods, are not real gods. And so why are they wasting their money on this stuff? So Demetrius' business is threatened, which means his other business partners, their business is threatened, their wealth is threatened, and so Demetrius is pretty put out about what Paul is doing and about what Paul is saying. So what are they going to do? Well, in verse 27 he says, there is danger not only that this trade of ours may come into disrepute, where people might start looking at us and going, ew, idol makers. Don't you guys know better than to make idols? Those aren't gods. You're scamming people, right? Not only will our business, our trade come into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be counted as nothing, and that she may even be deposed from her magnificence, she whom Asia and all the world worship. Now, the temple to the goddess Artemis in Ephesus was an incredible thing to see. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was a magnificent temple. So, not surprising that people came to see it, people came to worship there, people came and brought all these idols. And here's what Demetrius is saying. They've got this really powerful combination of religion and money that are being threatened by Paul's message. And really not just religion and money, but also something of their identity as a city, right? As Ephesus. Like, what if people stop worshiping Artemis? Is that going to dry up our tourism money because they're not going to come to see her temple and worship at her temple anymore? It's certainly already drying up our business of crafting these shrines to Artemis. Like, is the goddess who our city is famous for, if she comes into disrepute, then we come into disrepute and our city starts to collapse? Guys, we have got a major problem on our hands. Right? That combination of religion and money, we know, is a powerful one. Right? It's still a powerful one today. If you threaten someone's money or religion, right, that can be dangerous, and especially when people combine those two, right? It's a powerful motivator. That was true in his day, it's true in ours. And Paul's message was striking at the heart of both. Not just because he was saying that those gods made with hands are not gods, but also because of what he was saying about Jesus. Right? We saw earlier, again, in Acts 17, where Paul not only preaches about who the true God is, but that the true God is going to judge the whole world, and he's going to judge everyone through the man whom he sent, who died and rose again, Jesus, the Messiah. He died for sinners. He rose for salvation. If people believe in him, they're forgiven. If they reject him, it's not good, right? They'll be condemned. That's the dividing line. So you have to be faithful to Jesus. You have to trust Jesus. You have to worship Jesus. That's what Paul's calling them to do. And many people are responding to that. Many people are believing. And alongside of that, he's saying that Jesus is Lord. He's Lord of all. Artemis is not Lord. Jesus is Lord. So again, threatening their worship, threatening their religion, threatening their money, threatening their identity as a city that's wrapped up with Artemis, all of those things. So, what happens when you threaten someone's livelihood and their religion and their identity? Well, usually not anything good, right? That's a powerful mixture, and it starts to explode, right? Demetrius sort of like piled the powder on and lit the fuse, and it starts to blow. So look at what happens, starting in verse 28. There's rage, right? Not just I'm a little upset. There's rage boiling in Ephesus, right? They're enraged. They're crying out that Artemis is great. There's confusion, right? Verse 29. The city was filled with confusion. People are rushing together. Mobs are always a mass of chaos. They're not organized. They're not reasonable. They're not rational. So there's confusion spreading through the city. It leads to violence, right? They drag two of Paul's companions into the theater. They don't invite them to come, right? They force them to come. They drag them there. So it's getting violent. Right, then there's more confusion in verse 32. It says, some cried out one thing, some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Right, so you've got this theater, like think of a coliseum or a big outdoor theater or whatever. All these people in Ephesus have rushed into this theater, and they're shouting, and they're dragging people, and they're yelling about Artemis, but not everybody's even yelling the same thing, and not everybody even really knows why they're upset, why they're there. They just know, hey, there's a crowd of angry people. We got to figure out what's going on. It's chaotic. It's confusing. It's violent. They're shouting, right? Verse 33 and 34. A Jew, Alexander, tries to get up and talk, but Jews don't worship idols. So when they recognize it's a Jew trying to talk to him, they shout him down. Right? They won't listen to him. And they cry out, Luke tells us, for about 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And I picture this, if you've ever watched like an international soccer match, right, where the crowd is just like chanting the same thing. It's like a wave back and forth, and they can do it forever, right? This is what I think of, like they're just shouting the same thing over and over for hours. What are we to make of this? Well, here's what we should not make of it. Right? This is not a model for Christian worship. Right? Sometimes you'll have somebody say like, well, if they can shout for 2 hours about how great Artemis is, surely we can shout or sing or whatever for 2 hours about how great Jesus is. Okay, time out. Luke did not put this story in here so we would go, man, why aren't our worship services more like this riot in Ephesus? Right? That's not the point. This is not a model we are meant to imitate. Right? Pagans can shout for 2 hours about their false god, but that's not worship. That's not what God wants us to do. A mob is not a model for anything good. Right? There has never been a holy mob. There's no such thing as a Christian mob. A mob is subject to the desires of the flesh. A mob is not rational. A mob lacks self-control. Right? One of the fruits of the Spirit, right, is self-control. So there's nothing impressive or worthy of imitation here. There's nothing about this passage that is meant to, inspire the way that we conduct ourselves or the way that we worship. That's not the point. Luke is telling this story to show that it is not Paul or Paul's gospel that leads to riots and violence, but it is those who stir up trouble in response to his message that are responsible for the riots and the violence. So even when Paul tries to go out there, right, he hears about this riot that's been stirred up, his instinct is, let me out there. Why do you think he wants to be out there? To lead the mob? Of course not. To quiet the mob, to try to bring peace, to try to restore calm. Now, his friends don't let him go out there because they know, like, that's not going to work, Paul. If you go out there, they're going to tear you to pieces, right? You're just going to make things worse. You can't make things better. They're mad at you, right? So you're not going to fix it. But that's Paul's desire. That's Paul's instinct. That's what we know Paul would want to do, would be to try to quiet this mob. He can't do it, though, so somebody else has to do it. Who does it? The town clerk in verse 35. Here's somebody who, in the midst of all the chaos, has kept his head, who's still looking at things reasonably, rationally. He's one of the leaders of the town, and he quiets the crowd in verse 35. And he tries to calm them down. Demetrius had stirred them up. Guys, our religion, our money, our identity as the city that worships Artemis, like, it's all being threatened by Paul. The town clerk comes out and says, there's no immediate threat. There's no reason to be violent and upset. There's no reason to be in a rage. Right? He says in verse 35, men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of Ephesus is temple keeper of the great Artemis? Like, guys, our reputation is set. It's solid. Everybody knows this. There's no threat to this. So, verse 36, seeing that these things cannot be denied, you ought to be quiet and do nothing rash. There's no immediate danger. There's no justification for doing what you are doing. And there's no reason for it. Verse 37, he says, you have brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. They didn't try to rob the temple of Artemis. They didn't try to burn it down. They didn't deface it with graffiti. Like, they haven't done anything wrong. You can't haul them in here like a bunch of criminals and try to bring in some like vigilante justice on them. They haven't even done anything. Not to mention the fact that that wouldn't be the way to do it anyway. So, if you've got a problem, handle it the right way. Verse 38, if therefore Demetrius and the craftsmen with him have a complaint against anyone, the courts are open. There are proconsuls. We have procedures for this kind of thing, right? This is one of the things the Romans prided themselves on. Order, law, peace, justice. Right? Now, they had lots of problems, like, let's not pretend that, but they did have, it, on the whole, a fairly orderly society. Right? And they tried to keep the peace, however we would have to be honest about how the cost of that peace, but that's what they were trying to keep order. Right? So he's like, if you got a problem, take it to court, make a complaint, go through the proper channels. That's the right way to handle it, not like this. Right? Verse 40. He says, we really are in danger of being charged with rioting today. I mean, we could have, if Caesar hears about this, our whole city could be in trouble. Rome does not look kindly on entire cities being stirred up into a riot. And Paul didn't do this. Demetrius did this. This is on us. Right? This is the people that live here. We did this. So we better be careful. We better calm down. We better handle this the right way, because he says at the end of verse 40, there's no cause we can give to justify this commotion. So even the pagans know, even the Romans know, this is not the right way to handle this. We ought not to be going about things like this. And Luke tells us this whole story so that not only we would know, and Theophilus would know, that Paul did not start this riot, right? But that even the honorable leaders of Ephesus did not blame Paul for it. Because anyone who looked closely at what was going on could tell that Paul was not behind the trouble, even though they were trying to blame Paul for it. So if Paul did not stir up riots, if he did not incite angry mobs, right, then all those charges against him about being a plague and a disturber of the peace, they're false. If he did stir up riots and did incite angry mobs, that would have destroyed not only his credibility, but a fair amount of the credibility of the Christian faith that he was seeking to spread. Right? It would have impacted not only him, but everybody else who was following Jesus, who was trying to tell people to follow Jesus. They said, well, what are your chief spokesmen? I mean, he's ruining cities. He's bringing violence. If that were true, that would have been a huge credibility crisis for Christianity. But it wasn't true. And Luke tries to set the record straight and make sure we know that it wasn't true. What Paul did was not stir up people's passions, did not stir up people's emotions to try to get them into a fury. Instead, what he did was he reasoned with people. He taught them. He had conversations with people. He sought to persuade people. And we must be careful to do the same. No mob can serve the cause of Christ. It's not possible. There's no such thing as a Christian mob. A mob mentality can only hurt the cause of Christ. It cannot help it. The gospel spreads when godly men and godly women act honorably, speak reasonably, and live peaceably, so that when others call us evildoers and disturbers of the peace, when people really look into the matter, they see not evil or violence or anger, but good deeds, and glorify God. Let's pray.